Hi, my name is Grandma Betty, and welcome to Grandma Betty's Recipes, the place where we dig up the forgotten meals that fed real families through real hard times, before fancy ingredients, before food delivery apps, and long before anyone had ever heard the word artisanal. There was saram, one ingredient sitting in every American refrigerator that could do it all. Ground beef. 1 pound of it could feed a family of 6, stretch across a whole week of dinners, and somehow taste different every single night.
The 1970s was the decade that turned this humble ingredient into an art form, and the women behind those avocado green stoves were absolute geniuses. These are the 20 recipes they never needed to look up because they already knew them by heart. 1. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. This was the dish that showed up when the paycheck ran short and the week still had 3 days left in it. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes was not a recipe your grandmother found in a magazine. It was something she carried in her hands, in her muscle memory, passed down from her own mother, who learned it during the Depression and never forgot it. You'd brown a pound of ground beef in a cast iron skillet, the same skillet that had been seasoned by decades of Sunday cooking and never once went in the dishwasher. Once the meat was brown and crumbled, you'd push it to the side and sprinkle flour right into that beef fat, stirring it until it turned golden and smelled nutty. Then in went the milk, slow and steady, stirring the whole time while it thickened into a peppery, creamy gravy studded with meat.
Ladled over a mountain of buttery mashed potatoes, this dish had a way of making a Tuesday night feel like something was going to be okay. The gravy soaked down into the potatoes and created these pockets of rich, savory warmth that no restaurant has ever been able to replicate. Not one.
When beef prices jumped 30% in the early 1970s recession, this dish quietly kept families together at the dinner table. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't supposed to be. It was reliable. And sometimes reliable is exactly what you need. 2. Porcupine meatballs. Now don't go anywhere. I know what you're thinking. And no, nobody was catching porcupines in the backyard. These meatballs got their name from the uncooked rice mixed right into the ground beef that poked out during cooking like tiny little quills. And honestly, it's one of the most clever tricks in the entire history of budget cooking. You'd combine ground beef with uncooked white rice, a beaten egg, minced onion, salt, and pepper, then roll the whole mixture into golf ball-sized spheres. Into a deep skillet or pot they'd go, nestled into a thick tomato sauce made from Campbell's condensed tomato soup, because nobody was using fresh tomatoes when a can cost 29 cents and did the same job. As those meatballs simmered low and slow, the uncooked rice absorbed the tomatoey liquid around it and swelled, pushing through the surface of the meat like a little porcupine getting comfortable.
What came out was something between a stuffed pepper and a meatball, tender and satisfying, with a texture unlike anything else. Church potlucks across Middle America featured these at nearly every gathering: PTA dinners, neighborhood block parties, Sunday suppers, after services.
They showed up everywhere because they fed a crowd for almost nothing, and somehow managed to feel like a special occasion. Your grandmother didn't need a fancy cookbook for this one. She just needed rice and a pound of beef and the kind of quiet ingenuity that the 1970s demanded of her every single week. 3. Tater tot casserole. Oh, now we have arrived. If one dish represents the entire soul of 1970s home cooking, its tater tot casserole. Known affectionately in Minnesota as hot dish, this combination of ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and those glorious golden frozen potato cylinders was the crown jewel of casserole cooking. And grandmothers across the country knew exactly what to do with them. The assembly was almost meditative. Brown your beef with onions. Spread it in the pan. Blanket it with condensed soup straight from the can. No water added. No apologies made. Arrange the frozen tots across the top. 40 minutes at 350 degrees, and out came a bubbling golden masterpiece. That moment when your fork broke through the crunchy potato crust into the creamy beefy center underneath was the dinner bell of an entire generation. Was it fancy? Not even slightly. Was it delicious? Every single time. I rest my case for an old-school American goulash.
Every Midwestern grandmother had her version of this, and every Midwestern grandmother was absolutely convinced that her version was the correct one. This wasn't Hungarian goulash. Let's get that out of the way right now. A Hungarian chef would weep.
This was American chop suey, the one-pot wonder that saved weeknight dinners when Mom worked late and nobody had the energy to wash more than one pan. You'd brown ground beef with diced onions until everything caramelized together into this deeply savory base. Then in went elbow macaroni, canned diced tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were hiding at the bottom of the crisper drawer, green peppers if you had them, corn if you didn't. Everything cooked together in that single skillet, the pasta soaking up every bit of those beefy, tomatoey juices, until each elbow was fat and flavorful and completely surrendered to the sauce around it. The beauty of this dish was its flexibility. If payday had been recent, maybe you'd stir in a handful of shredded cheddar at the end and watch it melt into gooey golden pockets throughout. If payday had not been recent, you seasoned it well and called it a complete meal anyway. Either way, it bubbled on the stove and filled the house with that particular smell that every kid who grew up in the 1970s can still identify instantly as dinner is almost ready. This wasn't fine dining. This was survival cooking that somehow tasted like home every time. 5. Salisbury steak with brown onion gravy. Before frozen TV dinners made this dish a pale shadow of its former self, Salisbury steak made from scratch was a genuine triumph of working-class cooking. Named after a 19th century doctor who believed ground beef was medicine, which honestly feels like information I could have used earlier in life. This recipe transformed 1 pound of ground beef into something that looked and tasted like you'd spent real money on dinner.
The trick was in the binding. Breadcrumbs soaked in a splash of milk, a beaten egg, garlic powder, and a good hit of Worcestershire sauce got mixed into the beef before it was shaped by hand into thick oval patties. Those patties went into a hot skillet and got seared until they developed a dark, gorgeous crust on both sides. Then they came out while onions went in, cooking low and slow in those beef drippings until they turned sweet and golden and barely recognizable as the same vegetable they started as.
The gravy built itself right in that same pan. Flour stirred into the onions, beef broth poured in slowly, everything thickening into a rich brown sauce that got poured over those waiting patties. Smart grandmothers made extra patties and tucked them in the freezer for emergency dinners later in the week. Children thought they were getting steak, and in a way, they were. Just not the kind from the expensive end of the butcher's counter. 6. Beef and cabbage skillet. When grocery budgets got genuinely tight in the mid-1970s, cabbage became the unsung hero of American kitchens. At 15 cents a pound, this humble, underestimated vegetable could bulk up a half-pound of ground beef into a satisfying meal for 5 people without anyone feeling cheated. German and Irish immigrants had been cooking cabbage for generations, but the recession of the early 70s made it mainstream across every background and every kitchen. You'd start by browning ground beef with onions in your electric skillet, that avocado-colored wedding gift that got used every single day because convenience was not optional in a working household. Once the meat rendered its fat, in went thick wedges of cabbage, sizzling and wilting in the drippings, releasing their natural sweetness as they cooked down. A splash of Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper, maybe a can of diced tomatoes, if you were feeling flush that week. The cabbage transformed completely. What started as a cheap, sharp vegetable cooked down into soft, sweet ribbons that absorbed every molecule of that beefy, savory flavor. It hit the table steaming hot with a side of buttered white bread for soaking up whatever was left in the pan. Nutritionists today would give this meal 5 stars. Back then, it was just called making it work, and making it work was the highest compliment anyone in a 1970s kitchen ever received. 7. Stuffed. Bell peppers.
Stuffed peppers had been around for generations before the 1970s, but that decade streamlined them into a weeknight staple rather than a special occasion dish. This recipe appeared in every community cookbook from Oregon to Florida, with minor regional variations, but the same beautiful architecture every single time. Bell peppers got sliced lengthwise, seeds removed, turned into edible boats.
They'd get parboiled briefly so they'd be tender by the time the filling finished cooking. The stuffing combined browned ground beef with cooked minute rice, canned tomato sauce, diced onions, and whatever seasonings your family leaned toward. Italian seasoning packets were extremely popular in 1970s pantries. Garlic powder was equally beloved. The pepper halves got loaded up, arranged upright in a baking dish with a little water in the bottom, and slid into the oven. The mandatory final touch was shredded mozzarella cheese, melted across the top in the last 10 minutes of baking, because nothing in the 1970s was considered truly finished without cheese on it. Each pepper became its own individual serving, which made portion control effortless and presentation automatic. They looked elegant enough for company, but were practical enough for any Tuesday night. Nutritionists loved them because the vegetable was the container. The kids ate them because they got their own personal stuffed pepper, and that felt important. 8. Sloppy Joes from scratch. Yes, Manwich existed in the 1970s, and yes, it absolutely made it possible to open a can and call it dinner. But homemade sloppy joes were a point of pride for cooks who refused to completely surrender to convenience culture. This was the recipe that older siblings had eaten in school cafeterias and come home wanting, recreated at home with more meat and considerably less mystery. Brown your ground beef with diced onions and green peppers until everything caramelized together into a savory, fragrant base. Then came the sauce, and the sauce was the whole story. Ketchup as the sweet, tangy foundation. Brown sugar for extra depth. Yellow mustard for brightness. Worcestershire sauce for that dark, complex undertone. A splash of vinegar to cut through the richness. Some cooks added tomato paste for body. Some added hot sauce for character. The mixture simmered until it reduced to a sloppy but not soupy consistency. Hence the name that made elementary school children giggle every single time without fail. Spooned onto soft hamburger buns that immediately began disintegrating under the weight of the filling, these sandwiches were messy by design and by destiny. You needed napkins. You needed several napkins. You needed to make peace with the fact that the filling was going down your arm, whether you wanted it to or not. Served with potato chips and dill pickles, this was weekend lunch perfection. Casual food that gathered families around the table without fuss or formality. 9. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. Every grandmother in the 1970s had a meatloaf recipe, and every grandmother was completely certain that her meatloaf recipe was the best one. I'm here to tell you they were all right, because meatloaf in the 1970s was less a specific recipe and more a philosophy about making ground beef feel like a celebration.
The base was ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs that had been soaked in milk, beaten eggs, finely diced onions, garlic powder, and enough ketchup mixed into the meat itself to give it a slightly sweet, tangy backbone. It got packed into a loaf pan firmly enough to hold its shape, but not so firmly that it turned into a brick. Then came the glaze, and the glaze was everything.
Ketchup, brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar mixed together and spread across the top, where it would caramelize in the oven into a sticky, slightly charred, deeply delicious coating that made the whole kitchen smell like Sunday. Baked for an hour until cooked through, it came out with that gorgeous mahogany top and juicy interior that sliced cleanly and sat beautifully next to mashed potatoes, green beans. Leftovers got sliced cold the next day and eaten between 2 pieces of white bread with yellow mustard. And honestly, some people will tell you the cold meatloaf sandwich was better than the original dinner. Those people are not wrong. 10. Beef stroganoff with hamburger. This Americanized version of the classic Russian dish became a weeknight staple by doing something the 1970s was absolutely brilliant at, which was substituting affordable ingredients for expensive ones without apologizing once. Traditional beef stroganoff called for tenderloin strips. The 1970s version called for ground beef and tasted just as satisfying, possibly more so, because it carried the particular magic of ingenuity in every single bite. Browned ground beef with sliced mushrooms and onions cooked down together in a single skillet until everything was tender and golden. Then came the sauce, sour cream stirred in off the heat so it wouldn't break, sometimes helped along by a can of cream of mushroom soup for extra body and insurance. A splash of cooking sherry elevated the whole thing, if it was available. If it wasn't, nobody mentioned its absence. Served over egg noodles, it provided a quick route to an elegant-sounding dinner that satisfied absolutely everyone at the table. This was one of those rare dishes with no complaints, not from the kids, not from the adults, not from the picky eater who objected to everything else on the weekly rotation. Women's magazines featured it constantly throughout the decade. Community cookbooks included it on the first pages because it required ingredients already living in every 1970s pantry and refrigerator. International flavor, domestic convenience, one skillet to wash. The 70s had found its perfect weeknight formula. 11. Chipwreck casserole.
The name tells you everything. Chipwreck casserole was born in the space between grocery days, when the refrigerator was getting bare, and someone decided that a bag of potato chips and a pound of ground beef combined in a casserole dish was not desperation, but creativity. They were absolutely right.
Canned corn, maybe green beans, everything into the dish first. Then an entire bag of crushed potato chips piled generously across the top. Cheddar cheese, if the budget allowed. The chips on top stayed crunchy. The ones buried inside turned into salty, starchy pockets of pure comfort. Families requested this even during better times. That tells you everything you need to know. 12. Meatloaf muffins. Somebody in the 1970s had a genuinely brilliant realization. Traditional meatloaf took an hour to bake, but muffin-sized portions of the same mixture would cook in 25 minutes flat, and every single piece would develop that caramelized crust all the way around that traditional meatloaf only achieved on its outside edges. This was an innovation that deserved far more credit than it ever received. The mixture was classic meatloaf, ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, beaten eggs, diced onions, garlic powder, and Worcestershire sauce. But instead of pressing it into a loaf pan, you'd scoop it into greased muffin tins, creating individual portions that cooked fast and came out perfect every time. The tops got glazed with a mixture of ketchup and brown sugar that turned sticky and slightly charred in the oven. The kind of glaze that made children hover near the oven door, asking how much longer. Kids loved meatloaf muffins because they felt like personal-sized dinners, their own individual portion that nobody else could claim. Mothers loved them because extras could be frozen immediately for emergency meals on nights when cooking wasn't happening. Served alongside instant mashed potatoes and canned green beans, this was efficiency eating at its absolute finest. The 1970s didn't slow down for anyone, and a good grandmother made sure dinner didn't slow down either. 13. Beef and biscuit ring.
This recipe had a secret. It looked like it took hours when it actually took 15 minutes of hands-on work. The beef and biscuit ring was the 1970s answer to making a Tuesday night feel like a dinner party without spending Tuesday night cooking.
Brown your beef with onions, season simply, spoon it into the center of a ring of overlapping Pillsbury biscuits arranged on a baking sheet. Fold the edges over. 30 minutes at 375 degrees. Out came something that looked like genuine effort. The biscuits puffed golden and beautiful. The beef center bubbled invitingly. The empty Pillsbury tube at the bottom of the trash can was your secret, and yours alone. 0 apologies necessary. 14. Beef enchilada casserole. The 1970s discovered Mexican food, filtered through a Midwestern sensibility in whatever the local supermarket carried that week. Authentic it was not. Delicious it absolutely was. Beef enchilada casserole removed the time-consuming rolling step entirely. Ground beef browned with old El Paso taco seasoning. Canned enchilada sauce, mild enough that the children wouldn't protest. Corn tortillas cut into strips layered with refried beans and shredded cheddar. Everything flat in a casserole dish. Into the oven it went. The tortilla strips softened into something between chips and noodles. The cheese bubbled golden. Topped with sour cream, lettuce, and tomatoes, it looked genuinely impressive. Was it authentic? Absolutely not. Did everyone go back for seconds? Without exception. Every single time. 15. Beef stuffed potato boats. There is something deeply satisfying about a meal that comes in its own edible container. And your grandmother understood this long before any modern restaurant started serving things in tiny cast iron skillets to justify a $22 entree. Beef stuffed potato boats were the 1970s version of edible vessel dining, and they were magnificent.
Large russet potatoes got baked until their skins were crispy and their insides were fluffy and yielding. Once cool enough to handle, they'd get sliced lengthwise and scooped out carefully, the potato flesh going into a bowl where it got mashed with butter, sour cream, salt, and pepper. Ground beef, browned with onions, and a spoonful of tomato paste got folded into that creamy mashed potato mixture, creating a filling that was rich and savory and completely satisfying.
Everything got spooned back into the waiting potato skins, mounded generously, topped with shredded cheddar and maybe a sprinkle of paprika for color. Back under the broiler until the cheese bubbled and spotted brown, these potato boats emerged looking like individual little meals designed specifically for whoever was sitting at your spot at the table. Each one was its own self-contained dinner, protein, starch, and dairy, all in one crispy, edible vessel. Children adored them because eating something that came in a boat made dinner feel like an adventure. Grandmothers adored them because a pound of beef stretched beautifully across 6 hungry people without anyone feeling like they'd gotten the short end. 16. Hamburger soup. I can already feel some of you raising an eyebrow, and I want you to stop that right now, because hamburger soup was one of the most genius inventions in the entire 1970s ground beef repertoire. Ground beef, vegetables, and a rich broth all simmered together into the ultimate cold weather comfort food. It was like having a burger and a bowl of vegetable soup simultaneously, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. The secret was in letting the ground beef truly become part of the broth. You'd brown it first, then drain off the excess fat, then return it to the pot with diced carrots, celery, onions, and potatoes. Beef broth went in next, sometimes boosted with a bouillon cube for extra depth, along with diced tomatoes or tomato sauce for tang and color. A handful of barley or elbow macaroni could go in to bulk it up, turning soup into something hearty enough to be the whole meal. As it simmered low on the back burner, the vegetables softened and the broth absorbed the beef flavors until every spoonful tasted like it had been cooking since morning. Leftovers tasted even better the next day once the flavors had spent the night getting to know each other. A single pound of ground beef could produce enough soup to feed a family of 6, with enough left over for tomorrow's lunch. That was the 1970s magic equation, and hamburger soup solved it beautifully every single time. 17. Corn chip beef bake. Sometimes the best recipes started as an accident, and corn chip beef bake almost certainly began when someone looked at a bag of Fritos going stale and decided that throwing them into a casserole dish was the only reasonable course of action. I respect that person enormously.
Ground beef got browned and seasoned with chili powder and cumin, or a taco seasoning packet, if the budget allowed. Canned beans, corn, and diced tomatoes went in next, stretching the meat without anyone noticing. The whole mixture went into the casserole dish and waited for its crowning glory, a thick layer of crushed corn chips across the top, followed by whatever shredded cheese was on hand.
The chips baked into a crunchy, golden crust. The cheese bubbled into something irresistible. The beef underneath stayed tender and saucy and deeply satisfying. Tex-Mex filtered through a 1970s suburban kitchen, imperfect, creative, completely satisfying, and absolutely unforgettable, just like the decade itself. 18. Sloppy Joe pie. When regular Sloppy Joes weren't quite formal enough for Sunday dinner, but the weekly budget couldn't stretch to an actual roast, creative grandmothers invented the Sloppy Joe pie, and in doing so, accidentally created something better than both. This was the dish that made ground beef feel like a genuine occasion without spending a single extra dollar to get there. The base started exactly like any proper Sloppy Joe. Ground beef browned with diced onions, then seasoned with ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, brown sugar, and yellow mustard until it hit that perfect sweet, tangy, savory balance that children requested by name. But instead of piling it onto hamburger buns that would disintegrate under the pressure of the filling, the mixture went into a casserole dish and got topped with cornbread batter, either from a simple box mix or from scratch, if time allowed, and pride demanded it. As it baked, something almost magical happened. The cornbread rose and turned a beautiful golden color, while its bottom soaked up just enough of the beef juices to stay moist and deeply flavored. The result looked like a proper, serious dinner that belonged on any table, even when unexpected company knocked on the door on a Sunday evening. Sliced into squares and served with a simple salad or canned green beans, this dish had a way of making everyone feel like they were eating something special, which they absolutely were, regardless of what the grocery receipt said. 19. Mock prime rib patties. The mock trend of the 1970s reached its peak aspiration with mock prime rib patties, and I want to take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of the name alone. When actual prime rib cost an entire week's grocery budget, grandmothers created recipes that captured the essence of luxury without the expense, then presented them with complete confidence and zero apology. That is a skill. That is actually a life skill. Ground beef got mixed with breadcrumbs, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and the secret ingredient that every 1970s pantry kept on hand, liquid smoke.
That small brown bottle was a miracle of modern food technology, bringing genuine campfire depth to a suburban stovetop in approximately 3 drops. The beef got formed into thick, generous patties and seared in a screaming hot skillet until a dark, gorgeous crust developed on both sides. Then came the sauce, condensed mushroom soup thinned with red wine or beef broth, poured around the patties and left to simmer until everything was glossy and rich.
The presentation was everything. These were not served on buns. They were plated like actual steaks alongside roasted potatoes and whatever vegetable the season provided. When you cut into them, they weren't medium rare like the real thing. But that charred crust and that savory, silky sauce created enough theater to feel genuinely special. They appeared at anniversary dinners, birthday celebrations, and any occasion that deserved something beyond the ordinary weeknight rotation. Nobody was truly fooled, but dignity doesn't require perfect collusion. Sometimes it just requires a good effort and the right sauce. 20. Beef and potato casserole. And here we are at number 20. Beef and potato casserole is the dish that says everything about 1970s home cooking without using a single complicated word. Thinly sliced potatoes layered with browned ground beef and onions, bound together with condensed cream of mushroom soup, thinned with a little milk, topped with a blanket of shredded cheddar that went golden and bubbly in a 350-degree oven for a full hour. That's it. That's the whole recipe. What came out was deeply, completely satisfying in the way only truly simple food can manage. The potatoes absorbed everything. The beef surrendered in tenderness. The cheese did what cheese always does when given enough heat and enough time. one pan, 1 hour, one family fed. The greatest cooking in American history happened in ordinary kitchens by ordinary people who simply refused to let the people they loved go hungry. And there you have it, 20 ground beef recipes from the 1970s that carried real families through real hard times with real dignity and real deliciousness. These weren't just meals. They were solutions, expressions of love, acts of creativity under pressure, and proof that a pound of ground beef in the right hands could do almost anything. I'm Grandma Betty, and this has been Grandma Betty's Recipes. If any of these dishes lived on your grandmother's table, I want to hear about it in the comments below, because these stories matter and they deserve to be remembered. If you're new here, please subscribe, because we have decades more of forgotten food to uncover together, and I am just getting warmed up. Now go call somebody you love and make one of these recipes this week. I promise you won't regret it. See you next time.